All right, greetings and welcome everybody to another edition of the new podcast, New Elder Wisdom, with our special sections here, Chronicles of the Council of the Third Way. Really excited about today. Have two of my dearest friends in the world here, Kale KaaleKahi and Dr. Zach Stein. And I was thinking about this morning about all what unites us in our purposes and our drive, and it always goes back to me and Zach met at a place called the Dirty Truth on the corner of this bar, and I think maybe for the three of us, we've been out there seeking the dirty truth all our lives, and as philosophers, educators, and cultural innovators as well as cultural preservationists. I think there's a lot of common ground to discuss, and also a lot of understanding that can come from the unique perspectives that each of you have. Um, so, without further ado, we recognize it here that the world's in trouble. Is everybody okay with that? We're not going to start off with any bliss-ninny talk, but we're going to look out there and say, okay, there's some work to do. And in seeking the dirty truth, that's what we've been hoping to do, is to find a way to cultivate human beings, to cultivate what is most precious about human beings and bring it forward. Um, but before we get there, let's talk a little bit about how did we get here? How did humanity end up here? And what are some of the, signs that we see that things are falling quickly, and that we are motivated by the sense of urgency. So, Zach, if you would begin there, how the heck did we get here as human beings?
It really depends who you ask.
Well, I'm asking you.
I mean, there's also like where we are and kind of when we are. And I'd say we're like way late in the game for a bunch of things that have been unfolding for a very, very long time. And, so you mentioned that things are falling, and then there's this sense of the fall, meaning like at some point we stepped away from some way and have been trying to get back. The term religion means to religer, means to rebind, to reunite, probably with something like reality. And so that notion of the fall is that like in every moment we can just be lost and not be with reality. And we've been making that mistake again and again and again in a kind of cumulative way, with moments of insight historically, but then mostly history being kind of a nightmare. And we're late in history, I would argue. So as a psychologist and educator, et cetera, whatever, I think of the mind, of course, as the root of the problem. It's clear that nature knew what it was doing for billions of years to continue to create more and more life, even out of life that was like dying and stuff. Nature creates more. And we come along in a pretty relatively short matter of time, threaten all life with extinction. So that's a little weird. So, that's not natural to threaten all life with extinction, I would argue. So how do we become that species that both has kind of the responsibility for all other species in a weird way, because now we can kill them all and have to choose not to? That's kind of a strange frame, but one that's kind of thrust upon you from a Western education of like, like nature evolved for a very long time really well, like net generative well. And there'd be like comets and shit, and fucking other stuff would happen, and nature would keep going, and then this human comes along, and that's why I think the story of the fall and other of these things are so classic across different types of lineages, because there's clearly some way that we can be making compounded mistakes or not, right? The other vision is that, we don't have to, there's a way, there's a garden, or in the Hebraic tradition there's the garden, and then there's the orchard, which is the other thing. The I won't bother with the Hebrew, but it basically means like the field of holy apples, which is the place we're trying to get to, which is different than the garden where we began. So that's my first thought, is like, we fall away from truth systematically, and then it compounds. And then, of course, there's all the history. We could talk dates, we could talk people, we could talk institutions, all that shit. But I'm saying at a very high level, it's some spiritual disease or mental error, right? They call it the devil, right? With the apple and the snake and whatever. So, I'll stop. I'm curious, Kale, how that landed from your perspective.
Yeah, brother. I think, for me, a lot of the things when I think about this falling, it does come from the mythic places, right? The stories that we're not only like conditioned to believe in, but what tends to happen just by enmeshment through just by participating, right? So, for example, like when I think about the indigenous wisdoms and the creation stories that come from different tribal people of the world that still exist today, even though we're pushed aside, right? Say, like, some are on reservations now, some are their sovereign nation has been taken away. Their stories still exist amongst the people in those communities. And so the function of the person through this enmeshment of a society that has seen civilization as something inside, where nature is outside. So that disconnect in itself creates a disruption in, like, the human soul's ability to really nurture themselves amongst the natural, which, as you were saying, is always been here and continues to have the regenerative qualities, regardless of how much pains or trespasses or thievery or extraction that does happen. So when I think about how did this all go, well, I see the tendency for the survival aspect of every person, right? Like for myself, like being a new father, a survival aspect that I had when I was younger has now evolved into this mature place where it's like, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice myself for whatever is needed for my child and for my partner to survive. Now, if I go out into the world and I imagine that everything is against me and I'm in competition, then I will destroy my competition and I will make sure that my family survives. However, if I approach the world with a kinship understanding, that I'm actually in reciprocity with these relationships, that they're not here to harm me or to take away from me, but if I have the relationship in an honorable, respectful way, they'll actually give me more than I could ever attain on my own. There's no self-made in the creation story. It's always everything else was there, and it's up to me as a human and my people to invigorate that channel of nurturing and nourishment again, so that reciprocity may live. So I become a part of the whole, where the existence of our society, because we come from imperialism, and the imperialism says that the land is property, the body is labor, right? Spirit must be controlled and institutionalized. Indigenous cosmologies must be labeled savage or demonic, because if we participate in those ones, then it destroys the entire foundation of our ability to create a marketplace and have profit over all. Women then are suppressed. The feminine of the earth, which is the great nurture, right? Radical indigenous hospitality is the phrase I like to use. So when that knowledge is dismissed in favor of abstract logic, mechanistic thinking, institutionalized spirituality, then yeah, man, woman's survival instinct is going to be like, well, I got to get out there and make sure everything else is diminished or put into a controlled box that I can now siphon and extract from. And I think that's kind of what happens when we talk about creation stories and the mythologies that come about in our society, because we are a globalized society, but indigenous culture is not globalized. It's something that's regional and happens kind of in pockets or in corners of the world. And I think it's really important for men like us to not only speak on that part, right, the imperialistic part, but also the re-indigenizing part, the belonging again, because we have to invigorate that story to come back alive. And there isn't enough of us out there. There's just three of us on the screen. And with the odds stacked against us, we still met each other through a dirty truth. You know what I mean? It's really not what everybody wants to do, right? Because a dirty truth isn't that, oh, something's dirty, therefore it's immoral. No, it just means it's unpolished, unfiltered, and it's, often messy, but it's real. And that's the thing about, a dirty truth is it's got dirt in it. Dirt brings life. Dirt nurtures seeds. And if we continue to seek beautiful lies, then we'll just keep repeating the mistakes that have come before us. And I'm not interested in that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Um, so yeah, it's really the stories that carry the mind to these places of action. And we see such a divergence of story between the ancient myths of indigenosity and the so-called West. And at some point, this story seemed to strip away an intrinsic value from that which could not speak for itself, stripped away value from that which was unseen to the physical eyes. And Zach, I'm wondering, with your educational background, are you able to pinpoint places where that story shifted and began to infect the Western mind?
The plow, maybe earlier, maybe earlier than the plow, something about animal domestication is very, very, very profound. Mm-hmm. And again, it's part of the Hebrew myths have a lot to do with, you get to name all the animals. Like there's this thing that's happening where we're not kind of part of the animal world. We're somehow like over above it, either shepherding it. And the first time you see agriculture, it's actually just the tending of naturally abundant places, right? And so the tending of the herd, the tending of the fruit trees, not agriculture, just making sure that something else doesn't get them or that this thing doesn't spread and wipe it out or whatever, right? So that begins, but that's totally different. And the agricultural revolution forces us to cut the balls off animals and whip the shit out of the animals and work them way more in specific motions than they would ever do in the natural world, and do a bunch of other things that required us to basically de-empathize, not empathize with the animal, right? And then we started to be able to do that to each other, and we started to domesticate the human in a very, very, very radical way, using the exact same fucking techniques as we domesticated the animals. That's most clear in slavery, especially large-scale agricultural slave things. Sorry about that, guys. I'm gonna
speaking of being a slave.
Bing.
Bing. That's actually a dear old friend, weirdly enough. I haven't heard from in years.
Right on.
So that's where I believe it begins with that. And now, of course, the question of why did that emerge is an interesting question. And I'm not going to get into that. There's a bunch of interesting books from, David Graeber wrote one. There's one on Against the Grain, which is by this guy. I think his last name is Scott. And there's different competing hypotheses, but it seemed to be almost an inevitable kind of archetype for large social groups to move into this thing. And it was ostensibly, in some sense, more secure, and it was easy to be convinced sometimes that it was kind of better than being out there for some reason. So it's an interesting question. So it begins with that, and it begins with that ability to take nature as object in a much more radical way. Now, ironically enough, it also means, and this is an interesting question for human domestication, it means that the human predation capacity, which is that our ability to be predators, which is something that we are fundamentally, mostly got turned on human-to-human predation. And then you get these radical social hierarchies and the amplification of warfare and violence in ways that are completely crazy and perverse from the perspective of what occurs in the natural world. And this is the result of a brain that's actually built for a large percent of it just to be predators. We were the fucking apex predator. And now we're just sowing seeds and managing animals that are not dangerous and being managed by those people who are allowed to still be predators, which would be the political class and sometimes the priestly class and the warrior class. And so this is a difficult situation to deal with, which is the domestication and kind of emasculization specifically of, meaning like the taking away of your ability to be a strong, powerful kind of predator by design of the society you live in, when you're built to be that way, or a certain number of you are built to be that way. And that set up this tension, which made the civilizations repeatedly collapsing. So that's the other thing. Like every time we did this, it did not work. And we kept doing it in bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. Well, if it didn't work, then let's do it bigger with more people. Like would seem to be the conclusion. And the and I'll stop after my last little story. The archaeological evidence was like you build a city on a river, you harvest all the lumber upstream to build your houses and stuff, right? Now, what have you just done upstream to the You just removed all the roots. You're just taking out. So now the next time it rains just a little bit, there's a flood. And so the number of flood myths are precisely have to do with the lack of foresight and the repeated mistakes in the early processes of urbanization, which were just, you just float the logs down the river. So you're going to log upriver. And then you just now all the soil comes down and you flood and there's a flood. So repeated civilizational collapse is also a part of the story, which is why you can kind of look at the process and be like, well, that's not the right thing. We've just never done it at planetary scale. You could just leave. And then there were always barbarians or whatever they were called by the civilized things who were like, I'm not going to get involved with that. I'm just going to like be on the periphery of that and like raid that and like steal stuff from that and like build something humane on the outside of it and wait for it to collapse. So that's a little bit more of it. It's long ago, I guess I would say, long ago. We began this mindset, and we're so deep into a mindset that can do factory farms and that can have sweatshops and that can overfish. We're so deep into that mind that it has to be an ancient little trick that got played like way a long time ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a movement guy, that's kind of how I begin to see it right at first. Is all of a sudden movement was reduced and therefore rhythm was reduced. Rhythm was reduced with what was going on in the outside world. And there's still that same amount of energy within the human being that needs to drive it upon the impulse of movement. So where is it taken? And so much of the work that me and Kale have done together with men, I think really shows a picture of this. I have this intensity, I have this aggression, and I'm either going to shove it down with shame and prejudice, or it's going to just disrupt everything around me. This continued need for intensity, and perhaps what we're looking at is a need for an evolutionary step of that impulse of predatory aggression, and how do we turn it inside out and allow it to become something new. And that's why I find with movement is when we change the way someone moves, they change, their consciousness changes. Exactly. Everything begins to shift, but it needs to be given a direction. It needs to be given the freedom of choice and an expansion of choices, really, within that. What came up for you during that?
Yeah, a lot. Like, whoa, because it's all one of the things that I want to preface too for people that listen as well is like when we're having these kinds of talks, it's not that like the story of people from tens of thousands of years ago is somehow isolated to like a skin color. And that's where it kind of happens for people. I know they like listen to it and it's coming from Zach. So they're like, well, this is a white guy story. It's like, it's not a white guy story. It's not a brown guy story or a black guy. This is the story of us. I mean, we're talking about domestication of animals, like from a people, like how you said with like shepherding, herding and things like that. Well, previously as quote unquote hunter gatherers, which is a term. This isn't completely true. It has some bearing, but it was really just like tending to the wild. People migrated with herds. And we're talking about land-based people. Now, what about ocean people? So when we talk about migration into the Americas, people don't understand that we came through the ocean. So a lot of our expansion before we ever domesticated a horse was that we built boats and we had ships and we knew how to navigate. And so if you have a people that are deeply in love with the world that is around them and are in constant movement with everything, like seasons, for example. I mean, when you get towards the equatorial belt, we have two, dry and rainy. But when you're up there in the north or the south, you're going to have winter time. And so people needed to have summer places to go to. So they were highly influenced by the world and the communication that they were being shown on how to live in right relationship. But they were constantly moving. And so what happens to people when they're like, I can't do it anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. That psychological kind of like disconnect, right? That cognitive dissonance. I think that happens when you have already an overbearing amount of, say, like people that are already in kind of like an impoverished state, right? So if we're not able to continue to give and receive within our own community and our own village, people will break off. And you see that naturally happen amongst tribes, especially from my knowledge with the Americas. All these different tribes that we know of were once like just a few tribes that traveled all together. But over time, the ability to sustain the larger populations, people broke off. Right. Now you have a son that no longer wants to follow the father's authority. And it's probably because he didn't have space. It's just like what you would see like in a pride of lions, for example. Right. So when people break off and they do that, and there's enough space and room for them to migrate, to receive the things that they need, that things can stay in balance, but they keep moving. But as soon as people don't want to move, as soon as things start to get sedentary, then we start to see these hierarchies and all these other things start to pop off. So for me, I think it's just a reminder that all of our ancestors at some point of this timeline had participated in this. Yeah. This way of like, let me come to a place and let me just establish myself. And then you had others, like you were saying, that raided, and they weren't barbarians. They were just those that held on to the movement. They held on to this understanding of seasons and rhythms and cycles. And they're like, this isn't good because I see what you did to the trees above the river. And I come here every season and you're making it worse. So I either need to establish some boundaries around what's going on and go on the attack, or eventually I'll die. And a lot of, tribal peoples have done that. They decided that, hey, based upon the prophecies, our time is over. And they were out. And then we never hear about them again.
Stopped reproducing.
Yeah, they stopped all of it. And they eventually went into a ceremonial death as part of their sacrifice to the larger world. And these are kinds of the stories that people don't understand because they think about it as there's a conqueror, a victor, and then there's a loser, and losers fade away. And that's a very imperialist mindset to imagine how our ancestors are. I mean, shoot, when we talk about just the navigation through the Pacific Ocean, it's one of the greatest feats of humankind ever. Yes. Not just the pyramids or building skyscrapers, but that people actually had a primal navigational methodology that brought them to every single coral, islet, small island that had no mountains. They were able to go there. How? Well, it's generational knowledge being passed down about these people exploring their own courtship with the world. What else ancestors are you going to show me? What else is there amongst the stars? And where can I go? They weren't going to colonize. They're going to experience because they were always on the move. And so even the populating of the oceanic peoples that we know of today, whether they're Melanesian, Micronesian, Polynesian, whatever we choose to label them as, we're all part of that genealogy that then also came to the Americas. And science is finding that out too. Because in our stories, we have sweet potato here in Hawaii. How is that possible? Potatoes come from South America. Well, we obviously, communicated, and we gave some of ours and we took some of theirs. and with that was the rewards of continuation of sustaining life in our homes. And that's what it was about. It was cultural exchange more than about domination. And that's the story I want to keep putting out there. Is just remember, we're here as innovators of culture, carriers of lineages, people that are connected to ancestry. So let's remember that story too. We weren't always trading in weapons of war. We're trading in food and music and song and dance.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So much of what we've been able to do, Kale, is kind of put a pressure cooker or put all those elements into a pressure cooker over 4 days and boil the men in it. And, the theme that keeps coming up over and over again with humanity is violence. And I had reached out to Zach and, is there anything you really want to talk about? And he kind of talked about it seems like we need to be able to extrapolate wisdom from violence. And I feel like you've helped me to do that, Kale, in the way that we use combat craft to bring out which is hidden within men, which is lurking in the depths. So yeah, Zach, I'd be curious, what was it that led you to the impetus of that being your focus when I asked you what you want to talk about?
Because there's some bad men in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's one of, so in the work I do in existential risk, looking at why the hell are we in a situation where there are all of these possibilities for destroying all of life? How did we get there? There's many what we call generative dynamics, financial incentives and other stuff. But a key generative dynamic is just what is called in Western psychology psychopathy, which means you basically have no empathy for people and are completely willing to relate to them as a predator. and to manipulate them as much as you can. And your psychology is not one where you have internalized your loved ones and live with a complex inner moral life where you're judged by all of these people who you care what they think. You have none of that. You're a very different kind of being who is capable of great misdeeds. And of course, the stupid sociopaths and psychopaths end up in jail, as it were. Not everyone in jail is that. Not everyone in jail is that. And if you have that mentality and you're not super smart, you're going to break crimes and you're going to kill people and you're going to do crazy stuff that's going to end up. If you are a very, very intelligent psychopath, you don't break the laws, you make the laws. Right? You're not stuck in prison, you're running the prison. Right. And so that's a phenomenon I've been very interested in trying to understand. And I see it as related to this broad arc of domestication of what happens to some of these energies, which are not evil in themselves, but which under a certain type of pressure become really bad. And so there's so I've studied a lot of the kind of like psychology of that from the Western perspective. And I always end up being like, wait, but aren't they just possessed? And then I'm stuck in this position of like, well, I can't say that at the meeting of the American Psychological Association.
I'll say it.
But at the end of the day, if you're, because I also do a lot of philosophy and theology and shit. And if you look back at the way we used to think about this, it wasn't Western medicine and it's a neurological thing. There was this much more complex way of imagining it. And so that meant other cultures had much more realism about the presence of a type of violence that needed to be just stopped and bound. Whereas modern, I think specifically Roman law and Judeo-Christian societies have created niches in which these things actually flourish rather than being stopped. And that was interesting. And so I've heard from other people I've spoken to who are in indigenous lineages that they claim that, no, we had a way to deal with that back then, man. Basically, and it had a lot to do with our initiation rites and the way we related to violence and things that allowed us to basically get that out when it was identified, or to not have situations where it would arise with as much frequency because of socialization. So I kind of come to Kale asking in a sense like, how do you bind this type of mind? And is it the case that's being disproportionately created now? I think so. Sort of a bigger problem than we would have had like back in the day. But I still wonder, like, this has always existed in humanity. Like Genghis Khan, Khan. Like, what brain can do that? Like, not mine. I'm way too nice. I can barely like yell at somebody who's done something actually wrong. I'm afraid of hurting them, So that's not completely true. But at the same time, there's an intensity to what's possible psychologically when you get into sadism and violence that our society often seems too weak to counter or too inarticulate to stand against, and too wimpy. Like many of the men are so pacifistic that they're letting their cities be, completely run over with criminal element. So this is the intro center. It's both like meta theoretical, like how did we get into this mess? Oh, bad guys. It's not just a bunch of mistakes. Like we knew better. Some of us knew better and did it anyway. So there's that angle. And then there's just, as a psychologist, I'm trying to think, who is that? How do you think about dealing with that? Has this mind always existed? What did we used to call it? How did we used to deal with it? These are big questions for me.
Yeah, this is a deep one, man. This is something that, I've pondered quite a bit because of just, within my own life. So I guess I could kind of like structure it this way, because this is a big thing, as most of our conversations are anyway. So I'm gonna see if I can speak on it in a way that can help the listener a little bit. So there's personal violence. This is how I kind of see it. There's like personal violence, and there's like systemic violence, and then there's like historical violence. So on the personal level for myself, right, if I internalize my shame or my trauma or the feeling of helplessness, then I will utilize violence in passive aggressive ways, or I will target it onto people who did nothing to me, yet I've internalized this thing that has happened. So then I use them as like a substitute or like a scapegoat for the things that I'm troubled by. And when I grow up in a society that is constantly violent, right, through many different forms, even through the media, and we outsource these things that we need to handle ourselves because we're not coming into ritualistic understanding, then yeah, personal violence becomes a thing. And if I'm intelligent of a predator enough, then I'll stay out of jail and continue to find myself into positions of power that I can commit this violence. So like, yeah, it's true. Now the systemic violence that I see is right, the architecture of empire, when we can create inequalities and extractions and dominations. So if my personal power resides in a system that's inherently built upon that, then I'll keep working the system because it benefits me. And then I'll eventually find that violence isn't just something to avoid, but it's to enact and then suppress it in others. So I get to perform this violence and no one else does. So now I get to stay in that position of power within the system that has established itself and such. Now, when we look at the historical violence, right, what is the legacy of this imperialism and enslavement and theft and cultural erasure? And again, it's like you can look at how many examples of emperors that have come and gone, whether it's like Charlemagne or Genghis Khan or anybody, you know, then we start to see like, okay, isn't there a saying that like 1 out of every 10 people is related to Genghis Khan? Like, whoa, you know, just in that, it's like, holy smokes, like this is what we're living in. This is who we've become. So what I understand that when it comes to our society, we are late in the game for this. We're already so far that I'm not saying that we need to recoup. I'm just saying we need to keep what is remaining alive. And whatever that remains can continue to flourish and to grow the way it needs to, because it's just like in ecosystems. Not every tree is an old growth tree,
Right.
but some of them are there. And you can still go to them and find them. And that's kind of how I see the work that we're doing, because when boys are not initiated into manhood through trials, when we're not brutalizing them, but to like temper their energy and to teach them responsibility with their capacity for destruction, then we can really change the story, because now the personal violence is able to be addressed. Now, when we're bringing that into communal rituals of grief, of what's happened, right? Grieving the violence that we've all been inflicted by. And it could be a number of issues, sexual violence, physical, mental, emotional violence. When we bring that into a communal way of healing, then we can start to change the system. Now, once we do that, the historical thing, we can't change what has happened, but we can really be in this present moment now and cultivate from that learning a new way that many of us haven't known. I would say there's very, very few people, individuals alive today that have actually experienced that and lived that. Those people are old and they're dying. And so many times I believe that in order for us to really navigate this history that we've inherited, old ways have to die, and grieving those rituals of allowing those things to die is going to help us in understanding our violence. And that's how I believe we can kind of bound the energy, that as survivors, we can choose to heal. We can become guides and protectors. We can be leaders of communities in a regenerative way that understand reconciliation and remembrance. And then we can also understand our accountability in our histories. I don't ever want to position myself as knowing better than anybody, because I come from in indigenous lineages. I grew up understanding myself as a native, but that's just something that I'm in because of how things have moved in my own personal history. I'm the most recent, in these islands of Hawaii to U.S. history, I'm the most recent invitee into this chaotic forgetting. But it's all happened to us. So there's a great reckoning that needs to come, right? Not only is there a forgetting, but there needs to be a remembrance. Not only has there been an orphaning, but there needs to be a fostering. And not only has there been this like radical displacement of people, but there also needs to be some form of reckoning that allows this grief and devotion to show up in this protection without the vengeance, so that we have boundaries around it. So to me, to extrapolate some of that wisdom from violence is just to compost our pain into power. And it's ancestral work. It's painful spiritual maturity for sure. But I believe in order for us to really move into this place of ancestral repair and healing, men once again have to show up strong, confident, and courageous, and take the arrows you know, unfortunately. But I see that's the path. So stronger men with values and a foundation of brotherhood that wants to make these things integral to our lifestyle and to our culture that's emerging.
Beautiful. Yeah, I hear so much too about the same impulses that disconnected us from nature and the rhythms and cycles of life. Also, all of a sudden, you had a king or a chief, someone who could be like, go do the violence for me. They got out of the dirty truth. They disconnected themselves from that.
Soldiering.
They had soldiering. They no longer had to draw a knife across someone's throat. They, sent people out to do that, removing themselves from it. And I see so much of what we see in the men's work is this impulse of it's not okay to engage in conflict of any kind because it's mean. It upsets people. And then all of a sudden a guy who's never fought before gets a shot in the face, and it's like a revelation to him, and the tears come, and the tears have nothing to do with the pain of the shot. But what was dislodged by being so disconnected is now suddenly online, and it's present, and they're here finally. That's why we like to use other things like Sananga eye drops to just bring people into the immediate presence through the burning of their eyeballs. And so again, it's this this disconnect between the processes of life and society that seem to condense in those in power. Right? It's amazing how many men will admit to what they think they'll be like in a fight as compared to what they're actually like in a fight, and when those two things meet, an honesty can come about, and then an honesty about their own fear, their own feelings of smallness, their own feelings of isolation can come forward, and they can weep and be in their grief, making space for something new. I see that as so much of what we do is just emptying out so that the inherent divine intelligence that's in the heart and souls of every human being can come forward. But with all this repression packing it down, it becomes very, very difficult. So yeah, beautiful. Zach, did you want to touch on anything that came up through that?
I mean, I love what Kale said. I love what both of you said. And that notion that, there's these different layers of it. And so much of the personal violence comes as a result of historical systemic violence. And then this question of how to address those layers. It's the problem of our time, of how to basically find a way to negotiate power with the current situation for the sake of life and humans and cultural preservation. So I also like that notion, like, there's not any somehow healing the whole big thing right now. There is identify the old growth trees and protect those fucking trees. And because they have a bunch of stuff that we don't even know yet how valuable it is. And this is my sense of some of what's in the great traditions, and of course what's in the indigenous traditions, and then some of what's in even modernity. Science is not something we're just going to throw away. Right? Now, science coupled to technology and money making and all of that is something that has bursted the bounds of what was in fact just something else. So there's this question of what is worth preserving. To me, that's the fundamental question as an educator. What is actually worth preserving? And especially with the advent of the digital and the coming of the AI, there's a deep question of what does it even mean to be human? Meaning, what's worth preserving? Like, in the human. Fuck, like all the various cultures, like what? Like, should we be talking to each other? Or should we just have, like, you each have your own little jacked in, like, you replace a part of your skull with something like an iWatch, like an Apple Watch, and then now we're just communicating without speaking because, who needs words? Because we can jack into the mainframe and communicate on the back end through the AI, through the cloud. Whoa, my sense is let's not do that. There are other people's senses like, let's totally do that. And I'm like, whoa, we have a very different sense about what it means to be human and what should be preserved. And so that's kind of where I ended up being like, oh shit, yeah, we need to find a way to find the old growth trees that are worth preserving, that represent what the species actually was in its full, like, growth, especially like one of those trees that's not been around other trees that grows to its full kind of thing. Yeah, because otherwise we're left without exemplars of what human potential is and has been, and we're left with this weird kind of like downgraded human as a result of these upgraded technologies.
Yeah.
So that there's an answer there that we have to seek about
Yeah.
value and the perception of it.
Yeah, and I do want to get into value, and I think that Kale touched on what needs to be preserved and amplified, which is really the relationship to ordeal, right? Because without that relationship to struggle and intensity, I mean, the complete polarity of struggle is going to be that the iPhone in the head, right?
Yep.
Now
Exactly.
that's all comfort. Everything can be satiated right away. You know,
I mean, these insane motherfuckers, they actually talk about like, well, we'll have micro neurosurgery to the point where we can just remove memories you don't like from your brain,
right?
Like traumatic memories or sadness. And if you don't really want to ever feel depressed, we can, perfectly modulate your neurochemistry in order to not experience that. So they're literally thinking that that's what technology means. It means end of death, end of sickness, end of constraint, basically. Nick Bostrom talks about taking solar systems apart and putting them back together as computers for us. And he's like, what would it be like to have a brain that actually was interfacing with a computer the size of a solar system? Right. And it sounds so like
Rather than just relate with the solar system in the same way.
Precisely. It's complete insanity. And yet like it's taken seriously. Yeah. And so yeah, that's anyway, I'm just kind of like rambling now against the techno optimists and transhumanists, but it's a real thing.
Well, this is good.
We'll get there. We'll get there though. But for the people out there, I think we've really identified the need for ordeal and struggle.
Yes.
Because the opposite being, then you have, people looking for the ultimate comfort, never say anything that's going to make me feel uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form. And then suddenly they're making laws. Right in that image. And so that extreme between the two of ultra violence and ultra passivity, there's problems in both. And so how do we find that tension in the middle? And I think that the indigenous traditions that Kale has been part of, and in the West too, it's still spoken to a certain degree, but this relationship to ordeal as the initiation into the responsibilities that life is asking of us. And we get beautiful things like visions and insights and relationships and notoriety through the ordeals that we move through. So that's, I think, a lot of why we do what we do, Kale, is to keep the ordeal alive.
Yeah, totally. I think even to just I know we're going to touch on this more deeply here in a bit, but I just wanted to add in too, it's like this acceleration. I really like what you said. You said we've upgraded technologies and downgraded the human being. And I think a lot of this acceleration of these technologies comes from the separation of body and mind, as well as the domestication part of it, right? So when we stop understanding this technology of our bodies and the immensity that we already have of intelligence and of knowing in our bodies, and we're outsourcing it, it is a direct result of the systemic of the system that we're a part of. And so we're all slaves to it. And nobody's really asking that they're seeing this progress of technology as the key to their freedom, when it's actually the very thing that's enslaved them ever since. And so it's like, when we don't have the ability to understand our bodies in an intimate way and how we actually exist through the resources of what this world is providing us, then yeah, of course, like, people aren't going to pass into adulthood because they don't want to feel that limitation. They can't become a protector because they haven't confronted their fragility. And how will they ever become whole if they can't break the illusion that they were ever in control in the first place? That's an illusion. So it's really hard to do that if we keep creating buffers. And like, yeah, you just got to wake the people up to that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to add that in.
Beautiful. And, ultimately, this is all distilling down to a relationship with value and values. And, you said something interesting in a podcast that so often, Zach said this, so often the discussion around value devolves into my values versus your values. Mm-hmm. And we run into this in the men's work with personal truths. Mm-hmm. And then one guy who knows the truth, right? And this constant back and forth between that. And whenever personal truths are playing out in a communal situation, we have problems. And it always focalizes the energy towards the person who has the most dominating voice with their personal truth. So, Zach, I'd like you to speak to value and values, and this idea of the I of value, and how you see the two being different, and what we need to do to deepen our understanding of value.
Yeah, I think the main thing is just getting out of the idea that for some reason values are an arbitrary conversation, but things like how to start a fire or build a tent or make a piece of clothing that fits or find your way back to your car when you're lost, those aren't arbitrary. So like if the guy was like, hey man, it's my personal truth that you start a fire this way with water and this twig, you'd be like, okay, dude, you go start your fire. It's my personal truth that you start a fire this way, right? With matches and combustible material. And so it's like, that's obvious to people. And again, if the guy's like, no, it's my personal truth that the way back to the car is up the mountain. And you're like, well, actually the truth is that where the car is parked in the parking lot at the bottom of the mountain, right? So you go that way, we'll go this way. You have your truth, I'll have my truth. Great, right? And that's where the whole thing becomes insane. And then you realize, oh, it's just in these areas that have to do with sticky parts related to your identity that concern value and socialization and your parents and other stuff. That's where you're having personal truth. So really it's about how do you create context? And I think Ritual does this, where everyone has the opportunity to see the truth of what is valuable. In a way, you can see the truth that that's how you start a fire. Right. Because and this is to me what schools just fucked teacherly authority, because schools took it out of the context of like, whoa, we're cold. I can't start a fire. Dad can start a fire. I want to learn that. Then I will not have to be cold. It's just you don't have to talk a kid into that. You don't have to incentivize them with grades and snacks. It's going to fucking happen because it's so essential to the felt sense of reality. And so that's a very important thing that we're missing is a space where you can have non-arbitrary displays and conversation exchange about value. And I think that's what a lot of ritual I've seen does. Like in my experience, like in the Zen tradition, which is very ritual and very intense in terms of its rigor. The reason they do that is because in those contexts, it's clear what is a good action and what is a bad action in a way that's not anywhere else. Like in a monastic context, it just glows at you. Whereas in other contexts, it's so that's one bit. Create these contexts where we can see, and it sounds like you guys actually can do that because people will burn through their personal truths and actually get to something that is true about. No, that was not a good way to be. This is a demonstrably better. Like being a disciplined man is a demonstrably better way to be than being undisciplined. Full stop. Right, being someone who can maintain long duration friendships is better than being someone who cannot do that. Now, why are you undisciplined? Why do you struggle with relationships? Let's get into that. But first you have to say, right, being screen addicted, not a good outcome of adolescent socialization. So whereas we're perfectly fine learning science and stuff where it's not arbitrary, over here it's remarkably arbitrary, massively problematically arbitrary. And in the places where it's not, it's just my truth of the highway. It's fundamentalistly, reactively certain. So that's why we speak not about values, but about value itself and about a field of values that are all related. And the experiential access to the field of value is different than the semantic or linguistic access to an ideology about value. And so I'm saying, how do we get actual experience of real value as opposed to just a grab bag of values we've been taught to say? And very fundamental questions. That's why nature and other things, it's just so obvious that this sunset is gorgeous. It's just it stares at you in the face. And so there's places where it's clear. Is it your truth that this is ugly, bro? No, that would be weird. So when you bring it to extremes, you see, and that's why the nature immersion and other things really clarify it. So that's for me an educational question of what are those rituals and contexts that clarify the eye of value, make it really clear. It's not as arbitrary as we think.
Yeah. Can I chime in on that? This is great. This is So the thing that I see because of the society we're in, especially it being like Western or like American, I like to just call it American a lot of times, or I should just say United States culture, because there's a lot of different Americas. But like, yeah, there is this sense of it's a paradox, right? So the modern elevation of the individual, right, with the concept of personal development, self-help, this, all these things. So then now it becomes a concept that somehow truth exists within the person. Like how have we gone so far above all else, which includes our family, our ancestry, our community, the land, the collective understanding of how we get these things to work. So individualism isn't wrong, but if it's been distorted, right, or inflated or disconnected from this larger story, then yeah, we're going to overemphasize the self, and the symptoms is a value system, or like the symptom is the value system that it just continues to create this cultural trauma from the conditioning, right? So a modern self is a product of disconnection, and people aren't going to readily understand that when we talk about it, but maybe they'll get it from the end of a punching glove, you know what I mean, in their face, maybe. But I think that in the way, like how you're saying with the personal truth of like how that happens to others that are involved, yeah, it's like if you need to be liberated from a personal truth because you feel that you've been silenced or you've had to conform outside of your own desires or you've been oppressed, then maybe there is a truth that you've experienced that can help liberate you. But that shouldn't be used as a way to understand everything else, because that's just another form of this, untethered, like colonized mind, where the personal truth, not untethered to responsibility and relationship and reciprocity, will turn into like narcissistic behaviors and an avoidance of feedback in the name of their own boundaries. Or they'll create all these things within their mind about how to avoid it, because now healing means self-indulgence, and sovereignty can be masked as disconnection. And it's not that I'm against people saying this is my truth. I'm actually against how that shows up in the values that we're trying to carry as a collective. Because like how Hunter says, like when we're together for 4 days with the men, the first like 2 days, 3 days even, is just attuning to the collective.
Right.
It's really difficult to be culturally indoctrinated in seeing that independence is success, self-expression is the highest virtue, and freedom means doing whatever you want.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, this is the great challenge, I believe, with this work too, is how do we bring the individual back into kinship?
Right.
And those values will show up, I believe.
Where those sacred limits can be placed and loved. So often we're taught that authority and limits are something to be broken through and despised, whereas they can turn into something that's cherished and loved when responsibility is picked up in these communities. And so much of what I do with the Hawthorne work is to let people know that their small, broken inability to sing, if they choose to make a sound, actually gets lifted and adds to the harmony when they're willing to go into that discomfort and move into that place where their personal truth of they're not a singer, right? I always say, who in here cannot sing? Hands go up. Okay, all you have to do is make a sound. You have to promise me that you'll make a sound. And so all of a sudden, this personal truth that they cannot sing is destroyed.
Yes.
Because they've chosen to move outside of themselves and to raise their voice up, and it's something, man, to have 250, 300 men sing back at you. Probably 2/3 of them will say they're not singers, but when they let go of that, something new arises. When the personal truth is surrendered into the communal movement of things,
and the unique truth, which is different than the personal truth, the unique value, which is different than your personal value, which only you have, is very real. And that's the intuition sometimes we cling to, of unique value. Actually, no, there's something about Zach that no one else experienced. Like, of course, there's something about you that no one else has experienced. It's your unique self. And to the extent that you stereotype that experience, characterize that experience in other people's psychological language or trauma language or whatever, now you've de-uniquified the experience that truly was completely, you couldn't replicate it. right? And so that's like that experience with your dad. No one had that experience with your dad, right? There were people like that, but no one had that experience. And so that's why there's like a divine spark in some of the like individualism and some of the unique truth stuff, which is that sense of, no, there's a unique voice to contribute, even if it's broken, especially maybe if it's broken. Like some of the best voices actually are the weird raspy ones where the dude's probably got like throat cancer or something, but it's gonna be great for 5 years, like of that just unique broken voice. So yeah, Hunter, that's a really good analogy. Everyone can sing, everyone can walk, right? There's a bunch of sayings like that from some indigenous cultures where they're like, dude, you're really over complicating this. Like, human is basic. Human is basic, good, simple value. So yeah, and then I think this question of like the preservation of value that arises, because once you start to see it, you get to freak the fuck out because it's disappearing, because it's being preyed upon. The value is being hunted down and extracted from. Value is being hunted down, put in cages, and turned into anti-value or pseudo-value. And so immediately, that's one of the reasons people close your eye of value, is because it's really ugly to open it in some places. Right? That's where you have to bring men to the beautiful places, because then literally you can open it and your heart's not afraid. But if you live in a very ugly urban environment, it makes sense to just not try to worry about how aesthetic it is and beautiful it is, and not try to worry about if that was a criminal gang that just drove by in that weird car. Okay, let's not think about that. Like, what is happening? Yeah. You don't want to know what the actual field of value that you're wading through is. So I think this is some of what I see too in men, is like fear of seeing how much needs to be protected, right? Fear of seeing how much needs to be urgently protected and conserved. And if you're blind to value, if you're a relativist, you're not going to get super concerned. What are you like? What are you getting concerned about? Like, what's the worst saving? We're just matter in motion, and it's all meaningless. And every culture has equal value, and who cares? Like, you're not going to be moved to moral indignation and outrage and act. But as soon as you start to really see, no, that is bad, that is good. What's the ratio of good to bad here? Oh, bad is winning. You're like, no. Like, that's a whole different reaction in your body. And so I think some of the, like, you can't open it without, sometimes it's said by Gaffney, like you open your heart only to the extent that you can actually lean in and feel like you can heal. And so there's this disconnect where if you open too big and you can't heal, then you just shut it. So that empowering the man after that experience to feel like he's strong enough to now protect the value that he saw is key. And it's very scary to like really freaking love somebody. Very scary. And then to go to like a dangerous place, for example. And that's especially if you're a man and the person you love is a woman and you go to a dangerous place. How much are you willing to see how dangerous it really is? And how much are you really, really willing to care enough to be scared shitless about the fact that something of immense, immeasurable value is now at risk and you're the only one who can protect it. So that feeling of like, we're the only ones who can protect. Sometimes in the Hebrew tradition, it's called she, which is just the divine feminine, which is the most vulnerable thing that cannot speak for itself, that is at the whim of the more powerful things. That's the job of the divine masculine, to protect, basically. You know, it sounds whatever sexist, but that's absurd because it's a cosmic process, right? So it's deep fear of that responsibility I had in myself, frankly, because you don't want to realize, oh, right, there aren't any adults or grown men in the room to protect this vulnerable creature and whatever it is. So it's just, that's why I love the work that you guys are doing. It's so fucking important because once you can see the value, then you have to be strong enough with enough brothers to protect it, or else then it's worse. Then it's like then you're watching this thing you love be tortured in front of you.
Yeah,
like it's entertainment or something,
Yeah, that's why I can run my mouth at the men when Kale's around, because he's got me. That's it.
Listen. It's all love, though.
It's all love. Yeah, so much of this that's coming out is I love the term field of value, because from my background too in the subtle arts, I understand that which is forming everything we see is coming in from a great field of eternity, an eternal field, something that's beyond human comprehension. And it seems like what you're saying is like basically the intellectual mind can't figure this out. It needs to be a shared experience of commonality. And we're being human beings, like, the one thing separating us from the animal kingdom seems to be our forgetfulness, and so we need to be reminded. And sometimes that reminder comes in harsh forms, and it's like that limit is always an invitation to come home.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, hey, actually, you see, yeah, you did that over there. And that's why so much about what we're wanting to do here is about reconciliation and repair, about saying, look, this is how it is now. Just come in from the cold for a moment, and let's sit with it. Let's confront it. Let's take the time and cultivate the courage necessary. And look, you don't have to hold it all. We're all here together. And that's where the individualism thing, personal development as a tower of isolation and individuality, doesn't seem to be working.
Right.
If self-help books were gonna solve things, then we would be good by now. But there's still this drive of individuality, which, from my perspective of Western esotericism, this is also, the individual is also like the peak of evolution. But do we continue to descend from that, or do we use it as the turnaround point, or the place of inversion, the place where we now lift ourselves back towards the limits, back towards the commonality, back towards the ancestral responsibilities, through unique expression, which I think is why so often there's like a contention between Indigenous people and American people when they go down and just take things and say this is how they are culturally. Like, no, they then turn it into a universal personal truth, when it was an evolving force of culture in the past that was in relationship to everything around them. So it does seem to all boil down to education, and that's why, like, I know, Zach, you consider yourself one. Me and Kale run in a lot of circles where people want to be seen as healers, and they want to call us healers. And I do best when I relate to myself as an educator. And then the ceremonialist and the ritualist can come forward. And if healing happens, it's because I'm in attunement to what is needed, not to what I want to do. And so that emergence is needed outside of the formulaic at all times. That attunement is always needed, to the least. When I attune to a group, I say, who's going to be the biggest pain in my ass in this whole thing? and he usually reveals himself in the check-in right away.
Pretty much.
And I know if I can get that guy as an ally, then I'm doing well. And I also know that he will become my greatest ally, because he's doing that because he feels he doesn't belong, and he knows he's going to be thrown out. So he's got all the stories of why my authority and my dreadlocks are undeserved, and all his stories. And then just slowly I bring him closer and closer until he's coming and leaning his head on my shoulder. And then I know that I have educated him to a point where he can now receive the value of what we're doing when we go into the lodge, when we gather to drink, kava, when we gather to drink hawthorn, when we go and say, okay, actually now you're going to take your individuality and you're going to go be quiet with it over there for 4 days. and test it against that, So I think that it's really important to the young people out there that want to make a difference, want to see humans heal, that they move towards an educational stance, and they'll just become healers. Right? And they never have to identify that. And I think there's actually a greater empowerment and less of a potential for projection if we begin to relate to ourselves as educators. And we can also allow ourselves to be fallible in that, and continue to learn. And you said this term, Zach, and one of the things I was listening to, which is performative contradiction, which I thought was which is a great term, because we see this all the time. Men, they really want to be seen. They want to come out and show their thing. They want to perform their skill. And then we say, okay, do it. And then they're terrified, and it gets all weird, and everyone feels awkward. And it turns into this performance. But I was kind of curious what you meant by that. Like,
this is a very technical term in philosophy of language, but it basically means what you're saying, which is that you're saying something, but your performance, meaning your practice, contradicts that. So the classic one is like free will. People argue against free will, right? But you're going to take payments for your book deal as if you came up with the idea that you wrote this book against free will. So there's this performative contradiction where you can't coherently actually live as if there's no free will. Now, this is people who make the argument that there's no free will hate this argument, but it's actually a really good one. Another one is that I like to make this point is, okay, that's a great philosophy. Can you use it to socialize a young person or not? So if you are a reductive materialist and you believe evolution is completely arbitrary and you're just a like random meat machine in motion, great. You can say that from the podium at your job as a professor. Now you're sitting with your 10-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 3-year-old around the dinner table. What do you tell them about what they are? Do you, over decades, explain to them that their life is meaningless and they have no choice, and that no, you don't. You do not. If your wife lets you do that, you're one of those extreme nerds. But usually it just won't happen. You'll be forced to performatively contradict your own philosophical commitment because it just doesn't work in practice to believe that. Like, it seems great to believe that when you're just using language, but when you're in practice, you can't believe that. It's a similar thing I said about the fire. It's like, yeah, you can say a fire works that way all you want, but light a fucking fire. Like, can you do it or not? So it's a deep issue, and it gets us away from arguing with each other. Okay, let's look at what we're actually doing in practice. Are you living as if you don't have free will? No, you're not. Am I living as if I do have free will? Yes, I am. Who's making a better argument? Someone who can be performatively coherent with what they're saying, or someone who has to systematically contradict what they're saying in their behavior? This is true of passive aggressive people. I'm not angry. You're like, you're yelling at me right now.
I was just thinking about that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's the thing. So it's like, and it's everywhere. And once you see it, it's a useful thing. And but the walk and the talk not matching is the kind of more classic colloquial way to say it. And but yeah, you see it all the time. And when you give someone a chance, why monasteries and other ritual contexts are useful, because now you have a chance to show me. Do you really believe that or not? Like, do you really believe that your mind is actually infinite and that you can discover that and then you can fundamentally change who you are as a result of that? If you do, then you will sit still for 6 hours on that cushion and not move, because that's how you find that out. That's the Zen thing, right? So if you really believe, you'll not fucking move and you will sit there. If you're squirming around, getting up, have to go to the bathroom, like, you clearly are not really believing this. Because if you really believe it's the most precious thing you could possibly attain, it's just the purity of the insight and the mind that would allow you to be compassionate to all beings, right? Like, if you really believe that that's attainable, why would you do anything else? And so that's like the test of the ritual context. Similar to, I assume, like a sweat, where it's like, you really going to leave because you're uncomfortable? Like, we all just had this conversation about the spirit and brotherhood and all this stuff, and now you're afraid because it's too hot and you want to leave. You really didn't believe that shit you said. If you did, you'd stay here and actually maybe die with us. And that's just, I think, how it, and so that's another example where you put people in a position to contradict what they say they are. What they say they believe. And it's hard to do that, like in a university classroom or whatever. But you get kids out into the woods, and again, you're super big man, real courageous. Let's see. Here's the opportunity. Like, before it was all theoretical. Here's the opportunity. So yeah, that notion. So I would imagine you'd pick up on that, because it is your work, Hunter, which is just, it ends with the body. You can yakety yak up here with all the language and stuff, but at the end of the day, you're cashing this out in a movement. In a gesture, in an approach, in an avoidance, like it's going to land in your body. And that was huge. When I met you, I was like, oh no, because I saw my own performative contradictions in the way that I was caring for my body and the choices I was making. So
yeah, it doesn't always make you popular.
No, to demand coherence.
Zach, take my money. Zach, take my money. Here, sold. You got me. Performative contradictions and coherences. Wow. Yeah, it is beautiful to hear that, man. It really got me, just like thinking about the work that we do, Hunter, and the application of it. It's like, wow, yeah, we're working in a lot of different realms.
It's very hard to get people in touch with reality.
Yeah, and there is that thing that you said earlier, Zach, too, around the ritualistic value as well. Yeah, just hearing you talk about from the question that Hunter proposed, I was like, oh yeah, man, this is like, it's a deeper thread here being woven, kind of like the ritualistic value of these things that we do, unique as they are, beautiful as they are, that it really helps shape, the human experience and gives the invitation to the human soul so that there can be coherence between the theory and that's awesome.
Yeah, so much I think of the discomfort that people feel is based in their innate unease of feeling inauthentic. And that there's an idea of what it needs to look like as they're doing what they're doing becomes a performance, so that most people are actually performing throughout their lives. And there's this enormous hunger to actually know their unique individuality, which is clouded out by this, incessant pounding of personal and totalitarian truths. And so as educators, again, how do we get people there? How do we continue to bring them to their refined, authentic nature? Because, to me, ultimately, when you get to that authentic nature, suddenly you're like, oh, what can I do for other people?
Right.
What are my responsibilities? Because the individual, as it's told to us that freedom is you can do whatever you want, leads to misery and loneliness, And so we get to dance with these paradoxes all the time in the classroom, in the field, and in the wilds, and where we go. And I think it really is the challenge of our age is to get people to surrender their individuality for their authentic, unique nature.
Beautifully said.
That's what I feel like the gift of my own process has been, and how I'm always checking myself. I'm like, if I'm uneasy, I feel like I'm out of alignment with that unique nature that is in service, that is tending life outside of myself. So let's keep it going. I know your brothers have busy lives, and this conversation could go on for hours and hours. But I think we set a good solid foundation to get the people curious and to continue on the next conversation. This definitely won't be the last three-way rendition of the Chronicles of the Council of the Third Way here on the New Elder Wisdom podcast. So with that, does anybody have anything that they want to close with, or any final words?
Kale.
Man, just from this endpoint, it's like with ritual, we can be offered revelation, and I feel like this is a great ritual for me out here. I'm always be on this with you guys. A lot was revealed. So thank you, my brothers, for being involved, being engaged, even though there's overwhelming odds and we're kind of sprinting uphill. Thank you both for having the energy and the fortitude and the tenacity to keep going. So I appreciate you both so much.
Yeah, likewise. It was a wonderful conversation, and it's just there's a sense of like camaraderie and kind of brotherhood and kind of like mutual warrior kind of like hood, which I think it felt good. It's unlike a lot of conversations I have. I feel better, stronger, and not more confused and worried about the world. So,
That's it.
We got this.
We got them now. Yeah. So we'll see you in Maui soon then, Zach. Yeah, thank you again so much, brothers. And it's an honor, and so much of what I realize my responsibility is to be a hub in the network and to bring these conversations together. So thank you for helping me fulfill my responsibility today, and showing up and bringing your wisdom and knowledge forward. And yeah, let's keep it going. All right.
Right.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye to all. Love you.